I really am just very honored to be here to share space with you to think about storytelling and resistance in different narrative ways that we can tell complex narratives. I'm a lawyer and an anthropologist by training, and the focus of my work for the last 6 years nearly, since 2018, has been on surveillance technologies and the new ways that automation is impacting people on the move as they cross borders. I think it's really important also, and this goes to your point, recognize where we come at storytelling from. And this is where the kind of concept of positionality can be very helpful. And I always like to start off with this. So I'll share a few remarks with you, and then we'll have a discussion as a group about some of these things. Because we, of course, all are agents in the world, and we come to whatever work we do with our own sense of baggage, our own bias, our own histories, our own archives. For me, I now occupy a position of vast privilege as a practicing lawyer, a professor, and someone who runs a research lab. But I actually came from migrant justice organizing. And I used to do a lot of community work in different provinces, in Manitoba, in Toronto. And I also have my own migration journey in my family. So I've worn many hats. I now mostly look at, like I said, the impact of border technologies on people on the move. But I try and do it from a holistic perspective, kind of bringing the ethnographic methods of being present somewhere with legal analysis. I'm going to be showing a few photos and just a few prompts here. The next one is a little bit hard to look at, so I just wanted to say that before sharing. It's of a grave site in a place where I have done a lot of work. So since 2020, I've been based mostly in Greece and at the edges of Europe. For those of you who are aware of the migrant situation there, it's a frontier site of border enforcement and also a testing ground for much of border management technologies. And this is a region of Evros, which separates Greece and Turkey, a site of border violence. And almost as a pilgrimage, when I'm in the region, I make the drive to Sidero, the small village near the town of Soufli. It's actually very beautiful. Soufli is flanked by golden poplars, and it's also the home of the cemetery, which lies outside a village and is managed by the local imam. It's the resting place of those who died making the journey to Europe. And you'll notice that the majority of the graves are unmarked, but a few have inscriptions that have been painstakingly carved into the marble. And last time I was there was a relatively fresh earth on one of the graves of a young woman who died on the 2nd of February, 2021, only 8 months before I got there. She was from Syria and she was born in 1993. And there were still decayed roses on her grave, perhaps as a remnant of recognition and an act of care from the villagers. But as I was kneeling down, paying my respects, something caught my eye, and it was these 3 holes that were gnawed into the earth, crudely, and filled with standing water. 3 open graves that wait. So stories like this can be very powerful. For me, over the years, people have been incredibly generous with sharing their stories, often in the most difficult of times. We've shared food and sweet tangerines in refugee camps. We've cried together over the violence at the border. And we've also shared really bone-shaking anger about the systemic violence that's perpetrated by border regimes all around the world. But being entrusted with other people's stories is also a deep privilege, one that I do not take lightly. And storytelling is not without its pitfalls also. How can I, as a person in this space, limit the extractive nature of research and story collection? And how much space do I get to take up? Because the production of any kind of knowledge or any kind of story is always a political act. And I want to share some reflections of what I've witnessed on the ground. I try not to use the term in the field because of its colonial connotations, but I've witnessed the desire of researchers and activists and journalists to gather evidence and stories and make and take photographs of people in vulnerable moments without thinking through the kind of tremendous responsibility that is inherent in this kind of knowledge production. I've learned a lot from a colleague of mine, Kenya J. Pinto, who unfortunately was not able to be here with us. Her photos are much better than mine. You're seeing mine. But she really thinks through a lot of what it means to take photos and take stories. And we were together actually when the largest refugee camp in Europe, Moria, was destroyed in a fire in 2020. In the fall, and 13,000 people were brutalized as they were evacuated and confined on a sun-baked stretch of road, tear gassed, and then forcibly moved into a hastily constructed refugee camp. We got an official tour of the camp, official meaning, you're led along by border guards and police and only allowed to see what they want you to see, although there are ways to see other things. But what we were really disturbed by was not only, of course, the police presence and this kind of carcerality that's so common in the way that refugee camps are built and experienced, but also really disturbed by the practices of others around us, researchers and visual journalists. We've seen people push cameras into a tent full of children's laughter. We saw people taking pictures of a Black man bathing in the sea without asking whether it's okay to actually take these snapshots or collect these stories. So really, what does it mean to tell somebody's story, to freeze and capture a moment? And who gets to decide what images and stories represent crises and these really complex situations? And from a digital rights perspective and a surveillance perspective, whose perspective matter when we are talking about innovation and which priorities take precedence? What does actual critical representation in the space look like? Representation that foregrounds people's agency and doesn't actually contribute to this kind of poverty porn that is unfortunately very common. For those of you who do work in forced migration, I'm sure you've seen all sorts of reports, right, where you usually see racialized women and children in really destitute situations. And it's used so commonly, including by researchers and academics. So really, we need to question really how we take these photos, how we take these stories. And also, are we doing enough to generate space for abolitionist type conversations when it comes to technology, law, policing at the border? For me, I try and tell this global story of violence, power, innovation, and contestation through the sometimes uneasy mix of law and anthropology. And it's a slow and a very trauma-informed way of working, which also requires years of being present somewhere. And let me tell you, some colleagues who are not really into these qualitative methodologies don't get it. They say, why are you going again? How come you're spending so much time in this one space? Well, it's because it takes a long time for these really complex strands of power and privilege and story and memory to come apart and come together in different ways. It does not yield immediate insights. For me, it's also very personal. Like I said, my own migration and multi-hyphenated identity informs how I move through the world as a lawyer and a researcher and how I hold the stories that I'm told as well. So storytelling and story sharing is a very political act, and we must engage in constant reflection and recommitment towards building a different world. So how do we do this? That's the question. I have a few prompts. For me, one of my kind of pet peeves in this space, which I think we're moving away from, to be fair, maybe, is this idea of giving voice to the voiceless, right? How often do we hear that? Oh, we just have to give voice. Well, guess what? People have a voice. It's about who actually gets to speak that voice. And I really like this quote by Arundhati Roy. There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. Very helpful framing, I think. Another area that is quite, actually, sorry, before we get to that, I forgot to read out one thing to you guys. I passed around a handout, but I have it up here. Before we get to this expertise and knowledge creation element, I actually want to go back to the photography bit. There's different ways of thinking through how to capture imagery. And I think for a lot of us in this space, imagery and photography is very, very helpful, right? But again, like I alluded to some of the things that I've seen on the ground, it can be very problematic. One thing that we use with my team is a really, really helpful policy that was developed by the Forced Migration Review. It's a really interesting journal on forced migration. For those of you who work in that space, I would encourage you to check it out. It commissions very short pieces and they publish in a variety of languages and it's all open access. And they have a really fascinating photo policy that I would love to read out to you, especially for those of you who don't have the handout. So Forced Migration Review says, we know that real people's faces are important to bring to life the words, facts, thoughts, ideas, and feelings that are in the Forced Migration Review. We have always sought out images that show the personal reality of forced migration, trafficking, and statelessness. We know that in general, the photographers and agencies who generously provide photos for FMR's use will have sought permission from those being photographed. However, we have begun to question our assumption that it is therefore always appropriate for us to use these photos. FMR is distributed around the world to print and is freely accessible online, blah, blah, blah. However, it is also made available in other websites and in public libraries, and photos used in FMR are widely circulated on social media. In reality, we ourselves have no way to be sure that the people in the photographs could have given truly informed consent for their image to be used by us. Would they have understood that their image might be seen by people all around the world and that it would live on in the virtual world for potentially many, many years? And this, I think, is key. We think that there are cases where individuals would not wish their image to be used in such a way that they might be identifiable forever in a situation that is, in all likelihood, a temporary one that catches them at a low point in their lives. We cannot be sure either that showing their image will not, at some time and in some way that could not be foreseen, damage them or undermine their dignity. We therefore need to act with caution. We have decided that we should, whenever possible, protect the identity of people shown in FMR, unless it is obvious that this precaution is unnecessary, by avoiding close-up images of faces and, where necessary, pixelating. We realize that there is no perfect, correct way to do this. The people in the photos may feel that this robs them of their full identity. They may feel that we are playing into the hands of those who would typecast refugees as second-class citizens or as, quote, undesirables. It may also lessen the impact of the words, but we have come to the conclusion that this is a route we should try to follow. I think it's a really powerful statement because it's not perfect, of course, and it can absolutely be critiqued by saying, well, if we don't show faces, we don't focus on individual narratives, then we're dehumanizing a community and playing into a lot of far-right sentiments about masses, crises, flows of refugees. But the thing is, the alternative is not much better, right? You see this co-optation, this extraction of people's imagery, of people's stories without proper informed consent. When you're in these conflict zones, you see that all the time. People are snapping photos everywhere. Even if someone says, okay, yes, I agree with this one particular photo, you have no control over where that might end up. And then lo and behold, your face might be on the next UNICEF report. I mean, we would not be okay with that in this room, right? So why is the assumption that somebody in a situation of displacement might be? So in our project, we've adapted this way of thinking, and we only show faces of people who are directly working with us on their own projects or in some sort of long-term way. You'll notice in the photos that I will show you in the background, a lot of it is more of the infrastructure, the space, the environment, rather than, again, like masses of people or, focusing on individual stories that, again, kind of perpetuate that poverty porn depiction. But it's also interesting because I think that actually gets at some really other problematic threads that I want to just throw out there that we can discuss also. Because it's not only just about the visual extraction, but it's also about this kind of tokenization of lived experience, even by allies in the space. And often it's seen as like, for the greater good, we're going to bring on a refugee on our panel at the last minute. I can't tell you how many times, because I work very closely with people who are currently in active displacement, I will get an email from a colleague in Brussels, say, oh my gosh, we're doing a panel. Can you ask one of your people to come? First of all, I'm like, not my people. Second of all, like last minute, 24 hours before a big panel, why would that be the starting point? You wouldn't do that to a colleague, right? It's not about gatekeeping a community, but it's about honoring people's time and expertise and lived experience. And also not needlessly re-traumatizing them for the sake of saying, oh, well, don't worry, though, we have a community representative. Happens a lot. So the next kind of area that I want to throw out there is to tease apart and problematize the idea of who counts as an expert. Because really, when we're talking about storytelling, we're also talking about the production of knowledge. And in the production of knowledge, of course, we're talking about power and vast power differentials. Credentials, Western notions of knowledge and expertise are usually the ones, right, that open doors for you and get you to talk about all sorts of things, like I do. I'm part of the problem. And yet, there is this kind of tension between, again, wanting to kind of open up the space, so to speak, bring people in from the ground, but without actually thinking through what an expert looks like. We are still very wedded to these ideas that certain experiences have more weight in policymaking, in lawmaking, in academia, in publishing than others. And, to call myself out, again, I'm very privileged. I work at a Western institution. I have lots of funding. I get to go to all these places like the Trump Wall, walk along and see it, touch it, and then I get to go home, right? And even though I think really carefully and critically about how I show up in these spaces, and this is where the ethnographic method does help because it's not perfect by any means, but at least there's a commitment to showing up again and again and spending time in places over a long period of time. It is still a little bit of like a parachuting into a community, taking a story and leaving. Very common in the space. International organizations do it quite a bit. So I think it's something that we need to pay attention to, especially when we are starting to build new relationships with new communities. So what are some ways forward? I really like the concept of story stewardship because, again, storytelling is a deeply political act and it can and should be uncomfortable. I sit with this discomfort, which I hope is clear, but it's a discomfort that I actually find very generative and I don't want to step away from it. So what I like about the stewardship element, of course, the concept from Indigenous learnings that recognizes that a storyteller is not exempt from critical analysis as a person in their own power and privilege over other people's narratives. We must hold space for stories also to tell themselves and placing this kind of responsibility element at the center. I think thinking of storytelling this way can then become a profound act of resistance, particularly a resistance to these simplified and homogenized narratives. So when we're thinking about kind of how to do this, I think there's some areas that can help, paying attention to the language that we use. So in our work at the Refugee Law Lab and with the Migration and Technology Monitor Project, which I will tell you about in a second, we tend to use the people-centered framing of people on the move, while recognizing, of course, that there are different categories under law, geographically, such as refugees, immigrants, people who are stateless. We don't want to homogenize a very complex situation, but people on the move is a person-centered language. And it, again, I think recognizes that people also slip between categories often, right? You might come in as an immigrant and then become a refugee later in your life or vice versa. It's not as simple as fitting into these rigid categories. But there's also, of course, also other language that gets used a lot, right? When it comes to policy discourse, the news, flood, wave, crisis, migrant, right? These are very contested, highly politicized terms that are co-opted often by increasingly hardline far-right politicians who are very much anti-human movement. And even data and numbers, of course, can be twisted and politicized and co-opted too. This kind of, again, fear of being overrun by environmental migrants who are coming to our shores, right? And people kind of very rightly pointing to the vast numbers of people who will likely be forced to move. But again, how are we using these numbers and these data sets to tell different stories? Framing, of course, is what we're really talking about. And I think this is where narrative building ideas can really bring up a lot of tension, particularly when we're talking about the needs of activism, policy influence, research, and funding, right? There's different ways to talk about different things in different spaces, while balancing that with this kind of extraction, tokenizing, and the dangers of a single story. But ultimately, and I talk about this a lot with a colleague of mine, her name is Tendaya Chiume. She's a critical race theory professor and the former UN Special Rapporteur on discrimination. It's kind of listening for the silences, like who is not speaking? What kind of spaces are not being talked about and who is not able to tell their own stories and why? And for me, it really ultimately comes down to thinking about participation and seeding space that you perhaps are able to create through projects, through funding, through just being able to access certain doors. And perhaps it could be called the decolonial process as well, or a methodology that's never complete, but organically kind of always being rethought. And again, I think it can be quite seductive to get used to telling other people's stories. And there are many benefits that come to us from telling other people's stories. My own career, I'm writing a book called Artificial Borders about border technology. I benefit a lot from people's stories that they've been so kind to share with me. I'm not saying maybe I shouldn't write the book, but it's like I think it's something to think about as we move through this space and think about what our responsibility is when we are actually listening to people's experiences. So for us at the Refugee Law Lab and the Migration Technology Monitor, it's also really important to pay attention to geopolitical contexts and decentering global North narratives in all of this. So what does meaningful participation in this space look like, or what can it look like? Not tokenizing people with lived experience, but rather creating opportunities that recognize our privilege and access to resources and then redistributing these resources in a meaningful way. Again, creating environments for people to tell their own stories. So rather than talking in abstract, what can this look like? And again, this is just one small project, but perhaps it will give you some food for thought. So we started the Migration and Technology Monitor a few years ago. It's an archive and a platform, and we focus on surveillance, migration, technology, and human rights. And at first, it started off as kind of a place where a lot of work on this area could kind of come together. But because our mission is really to decenter, again, these so-called global North dynamics of knowledge production, we were like, well, instead of replicating that and once again producing knowledge on a particular community, why don't we actually get some funding and redistribute it meaningfully to people who are on the ground in situations of displacement and interested in doing work on these issues? And we also, so this platform is available in Arabic, French, Spanish, and English. It's pretty plain language. We have a map of all the different border tech projects that we've been tracking. But again, it will also be a place where our brand new fellows are going to be showcasing their work. So this is our first year. We literally just started this fellowship a month ago. So you're getting the kind of like hot off the press reflection. We are going to be making lots of mistakes and lots of co-learning throughout this year, because again, it's our first time doing this. But the ethos behind this, again, is to create opportunities for people with lived experience to meaningfully contribute to research, storytelling, policy, and advocacy conversation from the start, not as an afterthought. So we really are trying to create a collaborative intellectual and advocacy community that's committed to border justice as the starting point. So, and what does this kind of participatory methodology really look like? Well, one of the things is not giving people piecemeal funding. And again, I recognize that if you are a graduate student or if you are, embedded in a university that has really strict rules around how funding can be shared, it can be very problematic. We went through that too. I won't name names, but some universities wanted to take a huge cut from our grant. They wanted to say, oh, well, we can't fund people who don't have bank accounts. We can't fund people who are in situations of statelessness or in regular movement. We're like, well, that doesn't really work because that's literally the entire point of the project. So we basically plonked our money into what's called a fiscal sponsor. We don't have it in Canada, I don't think, or maybe there's a few. But it basically is like a third-party project manager that allows you much more flexibility. So we, for example, are able to fund translators in Iraqi Kurdistan or send money to someone in Syria, which like York University would be like, no way. And some of our fellows, we have Veronica Martinez, Neri Santaella, Well Kharsifi, Rajendra Paudel, and Simon Drotti. Okay. They're basically going to be working with us for this year, spanning from Venezuela to Mexico, to Uganda, to Nepal, to Malaysia. And they're fully funded with a salary, which also was a big fight, actually, because some of my colleagues wanted to prorate the salary based on where the person is. Which, okay, I understand there can be arguments made for that. But for me, if we're really working from an equitable model, why should someone in Uganda make less than someone in Malaysia? Why should someone with a bank account make more than someone without a bank account? Yes, it creates logistical adventures on our end, but I don't think that should stop us from thinking creatively about how to do this. So, really, this is our first year. Stay tuned how this goes. I'm sure we'll make lots of mistakes, but we'll learn a lot as well. And we hope to keep this going for the years to come. Because again, we want to create a community where people on the move themselves tell their own stories, and we don't predetermine what they work on. We got over 100 applications for this in a variety of languages. We also made sure that the application process wasn't particularly onerous. We asked for people to, first of all, self-identify. I'm not going to be policing, someone's identity. We told people to pitch their own projects in a 500-word statement in their own language or in a video. I did not anticipate getting 100 applications, so it took a long time to go through. But we ended up with projects ranging from a memory archive of psychosocial storytelling to original reporting on surveillance, to an application and a learning manual for migrant workers who are under surveillance. Projects that, again, are coming from people who are literally on the ground experiencing this, and also getting at the complexity of what it means to look at human migration. So I think I'll leave it there because I want to make sure we have some time for a discussion and some thinking and collective learning together. But I just want to thank you for giving me the time to reflect, because I think sharing time together is also an act of resistance and kind of slowing down with the stories that we tell. And I want to end with a quote from a colleague of mine, Ruha Benjamin, who does a lot of work on racism and technology. And this kind of slowing down of stories is a kind of stubborn beauty, a joy that refuses to kneel in defeat. So I think I like that a lot. I'm glad that we had a chance to slow down and go deep together a little bit. And hopefully we can use the remainder of our time for some conversation and questions. Bye.